friends. Hello, how are you? Welcome to the second installment of our 4 weeks together as we discover Celtic hagiography of the saints, of the Celtic saints. This in partnership with our good friends at the Celtic Cultural Alliance, and we are grateful to do this together and grateful to that wonderful organization, Grassroots Celtic Cultural Alliance. So my name is Tony Pompa. I am the dean of this cathedral called the Cathedral Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I am an appreciator of the transformation that I have experienced through Celtic spirituality and my discovery in my travels, particularly to the country of Wales, which is where my maternal family is from and is part of my DNA. So, good evening, welcome to number 2 of our hagiography time. So by quick review, for those who may not have tuned in last week, we are speaking on the topic of hagiography, that is particularly as it pertains to the Celtic saints. A quick review of all things Celtic, Celtic spirituality. When we speak about the saints that we are visiting through Celtic hagiography, we are speaking particularly about peoples who have been informed, nomadic peoples informed by what we call a Celtic worldview, and particularly the parts of geography where those peoples have populated throughout time are what we know as Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, or modern day a little piece of France, a little piece of Spain, and Cornwall, which is part current of England. Those are the places that Celtic peoples have occupied throughout history. And when we speak to the Celtic saints particularly, we're speaking about saints who lived and moved and had their being in those geographies. I also thought it might be helpful to you just to speak a little bit about Celtic spirituality in general, and Celtic spirituality, particularly Christian Celtic spirituality, but as it has been informed by the Celtic world view. And there are a couple of characteristics, I think, that I'd just like to mention that run and weave their way through a Celtic worldview, a Celtic spirituality, all of which in the Christian tradition, of course, were inherited, pre-Christian, in that world that would have been dominated by a pagan, druid, bard worldview. Nomadic peoples with a certain way in which they lived and moved and had their being and related to the world that they were in and around them and how they saw it. I'm just going to mention a couple characteristics of Celtic spirituality that have been incorporated into the Christian Celtic worldview. Number one, there is an understanding of the world that we are in communion with the physical environment around us. The rocks, the stars, the moon, the trees, the water brooks, the oceans, the ebb and flow, the animals that are around us, the trees, all living things, and the landscape. And the landscape, we're in relationship, communion with our physical environment. That runs very much through pre-Christian Celtic spirituality and in Christian spirituality, number one. Number two, that there is a kinship and place that we find ourselves in the rhythms of life. In the rhythms of life. That is important. There is a love of learning. That very much much, the love of learning very much in the early Christian Celtic church. The love of learning was very influenced by the Druids, actually, who organized themselves in small communities of learning, and even may have informed the early Christian Celtic experience of monastic orderings of things, where they lived in monastic settings for mutual prayer and learning. So, deep respect and communion with the environment, a love of learning. A third characteristic is what I call wanderlust, and I get this one. My Welsh blood just is full of wanderlust. That is a thirst to explore, to discover, to evolve, to grow, to learn about ourselves as we explore and discover. Very much part of the Celtic Christian experience. And the early Peregrini, as they were called, who went on peregrinatio, who went in the 4th and 5th centuries, those great Celtic Christian discoverers went off on peregrini. They went off on peregrinatio, that is to discover the kingdom that lived within them. And they're the ones that built the rickety little boats when they were residing in Ireland and coracles, and they jumped in them, and they just took off, and they didn't care where they were going. They just wanted to discover the world and God's place in it, and their place in God's world. There you go. Wanderlust. Deep respect for communion with environment, love of learning, wanderlust. A fourth characteristic is silence and solitude. The fourth characteristic of Celtic worldview spirituality is the appreciation for silence and solitude. And so much of Celtic spirituality, rooted in those small monastic communities, have built in them that discipline of finding quiet. And God knows we could use some of that. A fifth characteristic, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is the appreciation for the rhythms in the world, the rhythms of life, the rhythms of creation, the sacred, marking and seeing as sacred even the hours of the day, the times of the day, the movement of the light, the morning brightness, the setting of the sun, the noon high sky, and all things that can be lived into in a rhythm. And then bigger picture, the seasons, very much a rhythm of the seasons as the seasons of life transfer, and the appreciation for the gifts that are discovered in each of those, and the marking of the threshold, movement of life and body and experience and spirit through each of those seasons. And in the Celtic world, there, of course, are demarcations of those seasons in the pre-Christian Celtic world. A sixth and very important part of Celtic spirituality is finding the sacredness, observing the sacredness in the ordinary. Very big piece of Celtic spirituality, a piece that I appreciate much, in discovering and appreciating the sacredness in the ordinary. So the ancient Celtic world, where prayers would be developed and rituals over the simple things, from waking in the morning, oh God, the creator of all, the creator of the elements, I wake this morning to the rising sun, I rise, I breathe, I give thanks. Rituals that have been handed down to us from the Hebrides in Scotland that we're aware of, that date back to the 4th, 5th century, of a ritual of just getting up and stoking the fire in the morning, which would have been outside, creating and marking the peat, heating it up, and knowing that the life-giving spirit that comes from the fire and the warmth, giving God thanks, and usually in Trinitarian form. So modern day, I joke, I like to say I have a ritual of brushing my teeth. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, thank you, God, for giving me teeth. And then brush, 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 right? And so on and so on. characteristic, it's probably not a final one, but I'll speak just to 7, is in Celtic spirituality, Christian, is kinship, kinship with one another, humans, with our connectedness by our Lord's, by the masterful creation of us, that we were created for one another, and that our souls long for one another, that we were created that way, and if only we could truly live that way. But in the Celtic world, Christian world, the word soul friend means that we have discovered one another and live in one another's soul, a kinship. So, the 7 characteristics of Celtic Christian spirituality: deep respect and communion and relationship with the created natural order of things, our environment, a love of learning, wanderlust, the thirst to go and discover, silence and solitude, number 4, an appreciation and living into the rhythms of life and the order of things. Number 6, finding the sacred in the ordinary. And number 7, kinship, or soul friend seeking. So, there you go. I thought that we would just do that as a little base this morning, or actually this evening. I'm just recording that this morning. So, friends, hagiography, let's talk today. I said last week that I would do a little exploration of those different parts of the Celtic world and discover saints. Today, so last week we were in Ireland, and last week we talked about Patrick's hagiography and St. Bridget's. And today, I'm going to focus on St. David of Wales. So we're going to Wales today. I decided just to do one because the videos get long. It's a long time to be watching the video. So, back to hagiography we go, and I will say to you and remind you in review that hagiography comes from the root hagi, from the Greek, which means holy, and ography, of course, is a writing or a description. So a description or writing of a holy, or of a holy one in the Celtic saint tradition. I'll remind you that hagiographies are not historical documents, although there may be history woven through them. They may contain some history, but they're not written to be historical documents. And that most hagiographies were written, well, all hagiographies were written generations after the actual saint lived. They typically contain stories and descriptions intended to A, establish justification or make sense for authority or legitimacy or for a cause in a current context. Last week we used the example of Patrick and his hagiographers wanting to establish a place of legitimacy in a monastic order and monastery created newly in Armagh, and so they elevated and associated Patrick with that place. So that's one typical reason hagiography comes into being. B, to elevate a particular saint to a status of importance and of reverence in competition with other saints. Y, to legitimize the cultic practices of a particular time and place, to legitimize the cultic, the way in which they said their prayers, how they said them, thus increasing spiritual relevance in local people's lives, and as well as creating an economy for places that would be elevated in recognition when associated with a saint, so that pilgrims may visit and powers that be might invest. That's the second reason hagiographies were written. And the third is that hagiographies will all have stories of saints who have supernatural prowess in relationship to the natural order of things. And these powers, or miracles, as they're talked about in hagiographies, often align, most cases align with those miracles, powers of Jesus. Therefore, differentiating in the Celtic Christian world themselves from the pagans, from the Druids. So it is Jesus, as Christian folk, who exerts power in the world. And so the Celtic saint hagiographies will have really miraculous stories pulling a reference toward Jesus. So there's a review of general hagiography, and we're going to talk about St. David of Wales today, and we will, through this, be able also to experience what I'm talking about what hagiography is. So, St. David, many of you know, is the patron saint of Wales. He lived in the 5th century. He lived near the time of St. Patrick, when St. Patrick was living, and there are many scholars who believe that he and Patrick actually had a relationship. I'm yet to see any documentation of that, but maybe somebody out there has. You're welcome to send that on. But 5th century, living in the twilight of the Roman Empire. I love to use the phrase to understand the context of things. If you've not been to Wales, when David was living in Wales, for example, the Roman Empire was the sun was setting on the Roman Empire. And the Roman Christian Empire had one way of living and moving and having its being, and the Celtic Christian world had another way of living and moving and having its being. And that is not to say that Rome did not know about the Christian church in Wales. It did. It's just that Wales, for example, Ireland, for even more example, was literally the end of the earth for the Roman Empire. Like, you could walk literally to the cliffs of Wales and realize that you were on the tip of the Roman Empire. So, it's a kind of important context to understand. So, David, we know a little bit about David. Not much was written actually about David, who lived again in the 5th century, but there are ancient manuscripts that mention David from the 8th and the 9th century, so that's a couple hundred years later. But the most complete hagiography was written and is entitled The Life of David, and it was written around the year 1090 AD by Rigvarch. There's my Welsh for you, Rigvarch. So Rigvarch wrote The Life of David in 1090 AD, almost 500 years after David actually lived. So, first, what we think we know, or what those who wrote in ancient manuscripts would want us to know about David. So the 8th and 9th, this is before Rigvarch's writings. We know from the Irish church in the 6th century, there are manuscripts that speak to the Irish church's forms of worship coming from the holy men of Britain, of which David is named as a bishop. We also know that David was referred to in 8th century manuscripts as David the Aquatic, or David the Waterman, or Waterman. In Welsh, by the way, it is Dewi Saint, really, Dewi Sant is the Welsh for St. David. But David was referred to as the Aquatic in an 8th century manuscript, or David the Waterman. And that, we believe, comes from David's monastic practice of drinking only water. Now, he had to eat something somewhere along the way, or I think he just would have perished, so I'm sure he ate bread. But he would go on these disciplines where he just drank water, and that was in part of the rule of the monastic order for those who were in his order. Or there are stories of David going out into the Irish Sea, into the sea off the coast of St. David's in Wales. I've been there, some of you watching probably have too with me. But David is is said, would stand up to his waist in the water, David the waterman, with leeks over his head in hours of prayer, just in a discipline of hours of prayer. David the aquatic. We also know, because we've been there, that there was a monastic community established on the southern coast. It is said to be founded by Delisand, St. David. And some of us have been there, and we don't know this. We know this by hagiography, but not necessarily by history. But we kind of know that he was born of Non. Non was his mother, and Non's, who became pregnant with David against her will, how it goes, but turned that experience, unfortunate, into a time of virtue, and lived like the Virgin Mary, and she gave pure birth to pure David. His baptism is said to have taken place in the natural springs, not very far from where he was born, and those of us who have been to St. David's in Wales have been taken to what was overgrown brush, where just a little bit of dribble of water was coming, and we were told that that was the baptismal place of David. So those are the things that we've learned from the manuscripts from the 6th to the 9th century. But in 1090 AD, Hagiography wrote the Hagiography of St. David. So let's learn a little bit about hagiography through Hagiography's writing. So you remember the 3 little prongs that I talked about of what hagiography, why it exists, right? So we are establishing a tie to occultic practice. We are legitimizing a saint in place, and we are seeing in the stories the Christian Celtic connection to the miracles of Jesus through the supernatural powers, differentiating that experience and power from a Druid or pagan worldview, right? So here's Hagiography. Hagiography, who was he? Hagiography was the son of the bishop of St. David's, which would have meant that he was an educated fellow, and that he also had accessibility to all of the manuscripts available in the library there in St. David's, the library, by the way, which all of us have been to, although I doubt where it currently exists is where it was, but I'm not quite sure about that, actually. You need to know that, very important piece, to know why Hagiography wrote the life of David, Hagiography, in 1090. Hagiography was born into Wales at a unique time in Wales history. He was born into Wales at a time where it was unified, that is, the local chieftains and princes had come together under the leadership of Llewellyn the Great, and for a period of time, very brief period of time, in the early 1000s, the mid 1000s, early 1000s, Wales was unified and independent. Unified and independent. That's very important to know, because those of you who are history people, you will know that as time progressed through the early first 100 years of that century, of that time frame, that eventually that unification fell apart, and then in 1066, this gentleman by the name of William the Conqueror came from France, and he conquered Wales. And so what happened when William the Conqueror came is that, of course, what happens when occupying forces come, William the Conqueror, of course, taxed local kings and leaders, and he also brought changes from the Norman Church. So this Celtic Christian community was now being asked, was not even being asked, was being forced to change its cultic practices, the way it prayed, the way it organized, the way to French, Norman influenced reality. So why did Rivark write the life of David? He wrote it to preserve the traditions that were founded in the Welsh experience of prayer and national identity of Saint David. And to bring voice, his own, as a voice of protest against the subjugation of the cultic traditions that were being stamped upon and the Norman traditions that were taking his place. And at the end of the day, Rivark's voice in the life of, in the Hagiography, the life of David, is a rally cry for Welsh unity and identity in a time of history when it was being very much threatened by the Norman conquest. And that is how David was elevated to the saint who is the patron saint of Wales, which is a rally cry continuously, which continues in Welsh tradition. So there you go, there's the background of how and who and why, and Rivark, the hagiographer for David, who's written the clearest hagiography, which is in my hand. This is the very life of David, the hagiography. You too can Google this and print this out. I also have it in book form, but it's easier for me to reference it. I'm just going to read to you just a couple of things from the hagiography of David, and then we are going to say goodnight to each other. So let's find some fun stories, and let's hear also in this the mirroring of the biblical story of Jesus. It's an important piece of hagiography, right? So, let's see, what's fun? Let's read about St. David's baptism, right from the words of Rivark. Again, when David was baptized by Alva, bishop of the people of Munster, a fountain of clearest water, bursting forth, suddenly appeared in that place for the administration of baptism, which had never been seen before. It just popped out of the ground. Moreover, it cured the eyes of a blind monk who held him while he was baptized. For that blind saint, who, so it is said, had been born from his mother's womb without nostril and without eyes, perceiving that the infant, which he held in his bosom, was full of the grace of the Holy Ghost, took the water, wherein the body of that holy infant had been thrice dipped 3 times, and sprinkled his own face with it 3 times, and sooner than said, he joyfully received the sight of his eyes and the full complement of his countenance. And all who were present glorified the Lord and holy David on that day. Isn't that fantastic, right? Again, some of us have been in St. David's University. We were taken to the baptism site. They told us that story. It's a fantastic piece of his hagiography. And you can hear the resonance with the biblical story. Jesus in his own baptism came out of the water, was named, and he was well pleased. Jesus launched through his baptism into the life of healing and casting out demons and healing the sick and proclaiming life and liberty to all, right? What a beautiful hagiographical story. Let's find another. Oh, about the monastic practices of it. There's a piece in the Hagiography that talks about David establishing the monasteries. I'm not reading to you every little thing. I'm just reading to you little pieces of things. Let's talk about what it would be like to be in the monastic order with David. What David would have been asking you to participate in if you were part of that. How about the labor of the monastic life? When everything was completed, a saintly father decreed with fervor such rigor of purpose that every monk should toil at daily labor and spend his life in common, working with his hands. For he who labors not, says the apostle, let him not eat. So if you're not working, you're not eating in the monastery. For knowing that untroubled rest was the fomenter and the mother of vices, he subjected the shoulders of the monks to divine fatigues. For those who bend thought and time to leisurely repose generate an unstable spirit of apathy and restless incitements to lust. So if you were in the monastic order with David, you didn't have time to lust. And if you didn't work hard, you didn't eat. How about that? Let's talk about how they worshipped. When outside labor was finished, they returned to the cells of the monastery, and they spent the whole day till evening in reading or writing or praying. On the approach of the evening, when the stroke of the bell was heard, each one left his study, for if the stroke should sound in the ears of anyone, the top of a letter having been written, or even half the form of that letter, they rose up the more quickly, and they left their tasks. And thus in silence proceeded to church, without any idle talk. When the chanting of the psalms were done, the voice being in accord with the intention of the heart, they worshipped on bended knees until the stars are seen in heaven, bringing the day to a close. The Father alone, after all had gone out, poured forth a prayer in secret to God for the state of the whole church. How about that? All right, one more story that is more hagiographical, in spirit of the supernatural, just for fun. And let's read the story about the Irish abbot Bar, who used David's horse to cross the sea. We are using this story because David the Waterman, this is one of the stories, actually one of the stories from the 8th or 9th century that speak to David the Waterman. So, the Irish abbot Bar uses David's horse to cross the sea. At another time, too, when among others, that most faithful abbot of the Irish, whose name was Bar, B-A-R-R-E, had an unquenchable desire to visit the relics of the holy apostles, Peter and Paul, and undertook with unwearied feet the journey devoted to pilgrimage. After he had completed the salutary vow and was returning to the enclosures of the monastery, he visited the holy man, Saint David. And having sojourned there a little while by request in his holy intercourse, he was delayed for a longer period, for the ship wherein he had made ready to revisit his native land was hindered by lack of winds. I hate when the ship is hindered by lack of winds. Fearing lest there should arise contentions, strifes, and quarrels among the brethren in the absence of their abbot, the bond of charity being relaxed, even as bees, when the king is destroyed, pull asunder and ruin the stores of honeycombs, which they have secured with firm fastening. He searched with anxious mind and found a wondrous path. In other words, he really needed to get back home because he was worried that things were out of hand. For on a day he asked for the horse whereon the Holy Father David had been wont to ride for ecclesiastical purpose, and obtained leave. Having received the Father's blessing, he goes to the harbor, enters the sea, and putting his trust in the blessing of the Father and the support of the horse, he uses it for a ship, inasmuch as the horse plowed through the swelling masses of the waves as through a level field. Isn't that terrific? And it reminds you a bit of the disciples being out in the boat, in the storm, and even David's horse will carry the abbot Barry home to settle the chaos. All right, my friends, that's enough for tonight. That is Dewi Saint. I hope that you enjoyed our time here as we explore Celtic spirituality and hagiography, and we look forward to next week journeying and traveling together to another discovery of another Celtic saint. And we'll see you next time. Blessings and peace.